The transport ship groaned against the Atlantic swells, its hull carrying a cargo no one had prepared for: women. Not nurses, not spies, not the mythical warrior maidens of propaganda posters, but women nonetheless. Real women with cracked hands and hollowed cheeks, women who had operated anti-aircraft guns in Berlin, who had sorted mail in Wehrmacht offices, who had driven trucks through bombed-out streets when there were no men left to drive them. Women who had been told they were auxiliary personnel, non-combatants, invisible in the architecture of war. Women who had been captured anyway. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Greta Müller stood at the ship's railing, her fingers wrapped around the cold iron so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She was 24 years old, though she looked 40 in the harsh morning light. Her blonde hair, once carefully pinned in the regulation style required of Nachrichtenhelferin, communications helpers, now hung in limp strands around her face. The uniform she wore was no longer truly a uniform at all, just a gray wool jacket with missing buttons and trousers that had been patched so many times the original fabric was hard to identify. Beside her stood Ilse Hoffmann, 31, a former schoolteacher from Dresden who had been conscripted into service at a radar station outside Hamburg. Ilse had a habit of counting things when she was nervous: steps, breaths, waves. She had counted 2,317 waves since they left Southampton. She had stopped counting the days. "America?" Ilse whispered, and the words sounded like both prayer and curse. Greta didn't respond. She was watching the coastline materialize through the morning fog, a dark stripe of land that grew more solid with each passing minute. Somewhere on that shore was a prison camp. Somewhere in that vast country was a future she couldn't imagine. Behind her, in Europe, was everything she had ever known, now reduced to rubble and ashen memories she couldn't sort into any order that made sense. The ship carried 143 German women, ages 18 to 52. Some had been captured in France, others in Belgium, a handful in Italy. They had been processed through British facilities first, photographed and documented and interrogated, then loaded onto this American vessel bound for New York. The men, the thousands of German male POWs already in America, had camps scattered across the country, put to work on farms and in forests. But the women were a puzzle the American military hadn't quite solved. What do you do with enemy women? Where do you put them? How do you guard them? Below deck, in the converted cargo hold that served as their quarters, the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, salt water, and fear. Women sat on narrow bunks, clutching photographs and letters, rosaries and good luck charms. Some prayed. Some sang quietly in German, old folk songs their mothers had taught them. Some simply stared at nothing, their eyes tracking invisible memories across the steel walls. Frieda, 52, a widow who had worked in a munitions factory in Essen until the bombs finally made work impossible, sat with her hands folded in her lap. Her fingers were permanently stained with cordite and copper. She had not spoken in 6 days. Not since they told her she would not be repatriated. Not since they explained she was technically a prisoner of war despite never having fired a weapon, despite having spent most of the conflict trying simply to survive. "They say there's real food in America," said a young voice from the bunk below. Anneliese Koch, 18, captured while serving as a telephone operator in a bunker outside Aachen. She still had the smooth cheeks of adolescence, though her eyes were decades older. "They say there's so much food people throw it away. They say many things," Frieda finally replied, her voice rusty from disuse. "Most of it is lies." But Anneliese wanted to hope. She needed to hope. "My cousin went to New York before the war. He said the buildings touch the sky. He said the streets are so bright at night you can read a book by the electric lights." "Your cousin," said another voice, bitter and sharp, "is probably dead." The words hung in the stale air like smoke. No one contradicted them because no one could. They had all left people behind, brothers, fathers, husbands, sons. They had all left the dead and the dying. They had all left a country that was no longer recognizable as the place they had once called home. When the ship finally docked in New York Harbor, The women were kept below deck for hours while officials argued about protocol. Through the small portholes, they could see fragments of America. A slice of sky, the corner of a warehouse, the legs of men walking past. They heard English shouted in accents they didn't recognize. Heard trucks rumbling and cranes groaning, and somewhere, faintly, music playing from a radio. American music. Jazz, maybe, or something like it. Greta pressed her face to the porthole, trying to see more. "It's so clean," she murmured. "Everything is so clean." It was true. Compared to the ruins they had left behind. Compared to the bombed-out cities and ash-covered villages. Even this industrial dock looked pristine, untouched by war. The buildings were whole. The streets were paved. There were no craters, no collapsed walls, no blackened skeletons of what had once been homes. When they were finally marched off the ship, they moved in a silent column, 2 by 2, hands clutching small bags containing everything they still owned. American soldiers lined the dock. Young men in clean uniforms who stared at them with expressions Greta couldn't read. Curiosity, disgust, pity. She kept her eyes down and counted her steps, just like Ilse had counted waves. The buses that waited for them were painted olive green, military vehicles with hard seats and small windows. They were loaded efficiently, 15 women per bus, then driven through streets that seemed impossibly wide and impossibly full. New York rose around them like a fever dream. Buildings so tall they blocked out the sun, cars streaming past in orderly lines, people everywhere, people in good coats and clean shoes, people who weren't starving, weren't running, weren't afraid. "Look!" Annalise pressed her face to the window. "Look at the women's dresses. Look at the colors." It was true. American women walked past in dresses of red and blue and yellow, fabrics that looked soft and new, skirts that swung above their calves. They wore lipstick and hats with feathers, carried purses that matched their shoes. They looked like illustrations from a magazine, like people from another planet. One of the buses had to stop at an intersection, waiting for the light to change. Through the window, Greta watched an American woman with dark curls and a green coat cross the street, a child's hand clasped in hers. The woman was laughing at something the child said, her head thrown back, completely unguarded. When was the last time Greta had seen someone laugh like that? When was the last time she had felt safe enough to laugh with her whole body? The woman glanced at the bus as she passed, and her expression changed. For just a moment, their eyes met through the dusty glass. The American woman's face registered surprise. Then something harder, colder. She pulled her child closer and hurried past. The light changed. The bus lurched forward. They drove for hours, leaving the city behind, passing through towns and farmland, through a landscape so abundant it seemed obscene. Fields of crops stretched to the horizon. Fat cattle grazed in green pastures. Barns stood solid and unburned. There had been no bombs here. There had been no desperate winters with no fuel for heat. America, Greta realized with a feeling she couldn't name, had been somewhere else during the war. America had been eating and building and growing while Europe devoured itself. The camp, when they finally arrived, was not what any of them had expected. It sat on the edge of a small town in Pennsylvania, a collection of new wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing. But the wire wasn't electrified, and the guards weren't brutal-looking men with dogs. Instead, there was a gate with a sign in English and German. Women's Internment Facility, Fort Indiantown Gap. They were processed again, more photographs, more paperwork, more questions about names and ages and places of birth. Then they were assigned to barracks, given thin mattresses and scratchy blankets, shown the latrines and the mess hall and the recreation yard. It was all so organized, so clean, so utterly strange. That first evening they were fed. The mess hall had long tables with benches, windows with actual glass, lights that worked. American soldiers served the food, scooping portions onto metal trays. Potatoes, some kind of meat stew, bread, actual white bread, soft and fresh, and coffee. The woman serving the drinks, a tired-looking sergeant with graying hair, poured dark liquid into tin cups without comment, moving down the line efficiently. When she reached Greta's cup, Greta stared at it as if it might bite her. She hadn't seen real coffee in 2 years. In Germany, by the end, They had been drinking ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns and barley, a bitter brown liquid that tasted like dirt and desperation. Greta carried her tray to a table where Ilse and Anneliese had already sat down. The three of them looked at their food in silence. It seemed impossible, this abundance. It seemed like a trick. "Should we eat it?" Anneliese asked softly. "Why would they poison us?" Ilse replied, though her voice carried no conviction. "We're already prisoners." Greta picked up the coffee cup. It was warm in her hands, and steam rose from the dark surface. She brought it to her lips and took a small sip, prepared for the burnt, bitter taste of ersatz. What happened instead made her gasp. The coffee was real. Not just real but good, rich and smooth, with a deep flavor she had nearly forgotten existed. It was hot but not scalding, strong but not harsh. It tasted like mornings before the war, like her mother's kitchen, like a world where such small luxuries still existed. "This coffee," Greta whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "This coffee is heaven." Ilse took a sip from her own cup, and tears immediately spilled down her cheeks. She didn't try to hide them. Around the mess hall, other women were having the same reaction. Sipping carefully, then drinking deeper, then crying quietly into their cups. Anneliese drank hers in 3 long gulps, as if afraid someone would take it away, then pressed the empty cup to her forehead like a benediction. "I forgot," she said. "I forgot things could taste good." They ate the rest of their meal in silence, and if the portions were modest by American standards, they were a feast by the standards the women had learned to live by. When they were finished, when they had scraped their plates clean and drained their coffee cups to the last drop, they sat together at the long table and felt something they hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, not hope, but something adjacent to those things. Something that might, with time, grow into something more. Outside the mess hall windows, the Pennsylvania evening was turning purple at the edges. Somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird was singing. The sound carried across the camp, clear and untroubled, as if there had never been a war at all. The first weeks at the camp established a rhythm that felt both strange and familiar. Wake at 6 to the sound of a bugle. Wash in cold water from communal sinks. Line up for roll call in the yard, where American guards counted them with bored efficiency. Then breakfast, always coffee, always real coffee, followed by work assignments. The work was not hard by the standards they had known. Some women were assigned to the camp laundry, washing uniforms and linens in machines that did most of the labor. Others worked in the kitchen, peeling potatoes and scrubbing pots under the supervision of American cooks who spoke no German and communicated mostly through gestures. A few, including Greta, were put to work in the camp's administrative office, filing papers and translating documents. It was this work that gave Greta her first real glimpse into American life. The office received newspapers and magazines, and during slow afternoons she found herself reading them, piecing together English words with the help of a dictionary. The newspapers were full of stories about the war's end, about trials beginning in Nuremberg, about the horror of the concentration camps. She had not known, or rather, she had known something, sensed something, but the full scope of it had been hidden behind rumors and whispers and deliberate ignorance. Now, in the careful English prose of American journalists, she learned what her country had done, what had been done in her name, while she sorted mail and operated radio equipment and told herself she was just doing her duty, just surviving, just trying to get through each day. The knowledge sat in her stomach like stones. "You're reading too much," Ilse told her one evening, finding Greta hunched over a copy of Life magazine in their barracks. The magazine was open to photographs of Dachau, bodies stacked like cordwood. "You'll make yourself sick." "I'm already sick," Greta replied softly. "We all are. We just didn't know it." Ilse sat down heavily on the bunk beside her. "What were we supposed to do? We were children when it started. We believed what we were told. We trusted." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "That doesn't make it better," Greta said. "That makes it worse." They sat in silence, two women trying to understand how they had become what they had become. How their country had become what it had become. How the world had arrived at this particular configuration of guilt and grief and impossible moral accounting. Outside, someone was singing. A thin, wavering voice carrying the melody of Lily Marlene, the song that had belonged to all sides, that German and Allied soldiers alike had hummed in their trenches and tanks. The song that proved, perhaps, that underneath the uniforms and flags and ideology, they had all been human beings who missed someone who wanted to go home. But where was home now? Germany was rubble and occupation zones. The homes they had left were destroyed or filled with strangers. The people they had known were dead or scattered or changed beyond recognition. Home had become a ghost, something that existed only in memory, and even there was fading. The coffee, though, remained constant. Every morning in the mess hall, that first sip was a small anchor to something good, something uncomplicated. The American guards noticed, of course, how the women lingered over their coffee, how they held the cups with both hands as if warming themselves against more than just the Pennsylvania chill. One guard, a young corporal named Hayes from somewhere in Texas, started bringing in sugar and powdered cream, luxuries that made the coffee even better. He set them on the tables without comment, without ceremony, just one more small gesture in a strange dance of humanity between captors and captives. Why? Greta asked him one morning, surprising herself with the question. Her English was improving, but she still had to search for words. Hayes looked at her, this young man who couldn't have been more than 22, who had probably never left America before the war. Why what? Why kind? We are enemy. He considered this, stirring his own coffee slowly. War's over, he finally said. Seems like being cruel now would just be cruel. Wouldn't prove nothing, wouldn't help nothing. He paused, then added, My grandmother came from Germany, Munich, before the First War. Greta nodded slowly. She had not considered that there might be Germans in America, that the enemy might be more complicated than the propaganda had suggested. But of course there were. Of course the world was more tangled than the simple lines drawn on maps. Winter came early that year, settling over Pennsylvania with heavy gray skies and bitter winds. The barracks were heated but not warm, and the women learned to layer their clothes, to huddle together for warmth during the long evenings. They formed groups based on where they had been captured, what work they had done, what dialects they spoke. The women from Berlin clustered together, sharing memories of a city that no longer existed. The rural women, farmers' daughters conscripted from small villages, formed their own quiet circle. Anneliese, the youngest, drifted between groups like a ghost. She was still hoping, Greta realized, still believing that somehow this would all be temporary, that somehow they would wake up and find themselves back in Germany, back in a Germany that wasn't destroyed, back in a time before everything went wrong. She's going to break, Ilse said one evening, watching Anneliese pace the barracks yard, her thin coat pulled tight against the wind. We're all going to break, Greta replied. The question is what will become after. Christmas approached, and with it came a strange generosity from their captors. The American Red Cross delivered packages, not the German Red Cross packages they might have received as POWs in normal circumstances, but American packages filled with things they hadn't seen in years. Chocolate bars, genuine Hershey's chocolate, tins of cookies, small bottles of hand lotion, socks without holes, and coffee, real coffee beans in paper bags, with instructions in German for how to prepare it. Some women refused the packages on principle. We shouldn't accept gifts from them, said Frieda, the older woman who had worked in the munitions factory. It's charity. It's meant to make them feel good about themselves. Then let them feel good, Ilse countered. My feet are cold, and these socks are warm. I'm tired of principles. Principles didn't keep anyone alive. On Christmas Eve, the Americans allowed them to hold a service in the mess hall. There was no priest, no proper ceremony, but the women gathered anyway and sang the old hymns, Silent Night, O Tannenbaum, songs their mothers had sung, songs that predated the war and the Reich and all the ideology that had poisoned their youth. They sang in German, their voices rising together in the warm room, and for a moment it was possible to pretend they were somewhere else, someone else, untouched by history. After the service, the guards distributed hot cocoa, real cocoa made with milk and sugar, and someone produced a harmonica and played Christmas carols while the women sat at the long tables and drank their cocoa and let themselves remember what it felt like to celebrate something. Anything. Greta found herself sitting next to Corporal Hayes, the young guard from Texas. He was drinking cocoa too, looking uncomfortable in his uniform among all these women, all these former enemies who were now just people trying to survive the winter. "Your grandmother," Greta said carefully, in her improving English. "Does she speak German still?" Hayes nodded. "At home, yeah. My grandfather, he never learned English so good. They speak German in the kitchen, English everywhere else." He paused, then asked, "You got family back there?" "In Germany." Greta shook her head. "Mother died in bombing. Dresden. 1945. Father, I don't know. Last letter was from Eastern Front. 1944. Nothing after." "I'm sorry," Hayes said, and he sounded like he meant it. "Everyone is sorry," Greta replied softly. "But sorry doesn't bring back the dead. Sorry doesn't rebuild the cities. Sorry doesn't—" She stopped, unable to articulate the rest. "Sorry doesn't undo what we did. Sorry doesn't make us clean again." They sat in silence, drinking their cocoa, while around them women laughed at some joke. Someone's harmonica played a slightly off-key version of Still Knacked, and the Pennsylvania winter pressed against the windows like an uninvited guest. By spring, the camp had developed its own strange ecosystem. The women organized classes, German literature, mathematics, even English lessons taught by those who had learned the language fastest. They formed a choir that practiced twice a week, their voices blending in harmonies that transcended their different dialects and backgrounds. A few women with artistic talent painted murals on the barracks walls, scenes of mountains and forests and villages that existed now only in memory. The work assignments expanded. Some women were allowed to work in the nearby town, supervise day labor at the local cannery or farm. They rode in trucks each morning, returned each evening, and brought back stories of America that seemed increasingly surreal. "The stores," said one woman who had been assigned to clean a grocery shop. "You should see the stores. Shelves full of food, just sitting there. Meat and bread and vegetables all in one place. And people just walk in and buy whatever they want. No ration cards, no queues, just abundance." "The waste," said another, who worked at a restaurant. "They throw away food. Real food, good food, just into the trash because someone didn't finish their plate. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream at them. Don't they know what it's like to be hungry?" Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. These glimpses of American plenty did strange things to the women's psychology. Some became bitter, angry at the unfairness of it all, that America had so much while Europe starved. Others became determined to understand this new world, to learn its rules and rhythms, and somehow find a place in it. A few, like Annalise, seemed to shut down entirely, unable to reconcile the propaganda they had been fed with the reality they were living. Greta found herself in the middle, trying to hold multiple truths at once. America was wasteful and abundant and naive about suffering. America had also sent food and medicine and, yes, bombs. America was both liberator and victor, generous and calculating, capable of great kindness and great violence often in the same breath. Her English improved rapidly, helped by the hours she spent in the administrative office, typing letters and filing reports. The camp commander, a weary lieutenant colonel named Morrison who had fought in France and clearly wanted nothing more than to go home, sometimes asked her to translate for visiting officials. She learned the rhythms of American bureaucracy, the endless forms and procedures and protocols that seemed to govern everything. "You're good at this," Morrison told her one afternoon, after she had smoothly translated a complicated conversation between a German prisoner and an army chaplain. "Better than the other translators we've used. You understand context, not just words." "I was trained as teacher," Greta replied, the English words coming more easily now. "Before war, I was to teach languages, literature. Then," she gestured vaguely, indicating the vast derailment of those plans. Morrison nodded. He was in his 40s, with lines around his eyes that spoke of things he'd seen that he'd rather forget. When you get repatriated, he said, you should consider emigration. America needs teachers, especially teachers who speak German and English both. There's going to be a lot of displaced people needing help. The word emigration hung in the air like a foreign object. Greta had not considered it, had not allowed herself to consider it. To leave Germany permanently? To become American? It seemed impossible, a betrayal somehow, even though Germany itself seemed to have betrayed everything she had once believed in. I think about it, she said carefully, non-committally, but she did think about it. Late at night in the barracks, listening to the sounds of women sleeping and crying and dreaming, she thought about what it would mean to stay in this country, to remake herself entirely. Could she do it? Could she learn to be someone new, someone untethered from the guilt and grief of what her nation had become? Summer brought new challenges. The heat in Pennsylvania was different from German heat, heavier, more humid, pressing down like a wet blanket. The barracks became stifling, and the women were allowed to spend evenings outside in the yard, where they sat on the grass and talked and tried to catch any hint of breeze. It was during one of these evenings that Frieda, the older woman who had been silent for so long, finally spoke of what haunted her. They had been talking about the Nuremberg trials, which were being covered extensively in the American newspapers. The women had divided opinions. Some believed the trials were justice. Others thought they were Victor's revenge. Still others simply didn't want to think about it at all. I knew, Frieda said suddenly, her voice cutting through the conversation. I knew something was wrong. At the factory we made shell casings, bullets, components for bombs. But some weeks they would bring in different workers. Thin people, strange people, people who looked like they were dying. They wore striped uniforms. They didn't speak. They just worked until they collapsed. The yard went quiet. Everyone knew what she was describing, even if the full details had only recently become clear. I didn't ask questions, Frieda continued. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself I was just doing my job, feeding my family. My husband was dead. My sons were at the front. I had to survive, so I didn't ask questions. Tears ran down her weathered face, but her voice remained steady. That's what we all did, isn't it? We didn't ask questions. We just survived. And that's how it happened. That's how all of it happened. No one contradicted her. No one offered comfort or absolution. They sat in the Pennsylvania twilight, a group of women who had been enemies and were now prisoners and would someday be something else, something they couldn't yet name, and they held space for the terrible truth of what they had been part of, willing or not, knowing or not. Ilse finally broke the silence. My school in Dresden, she said softly. The headmaster was Jewish. Herr Rosenfeld. He had taught there for 30 years. One day in 1938, he just wasn't there anymore. They said he'd resigned. They said he'd moved away. We all knew it was a lie, but we said nothing. I said nothing. I liked Herr Rosenfeld. He was a good teacher. But I said nothing, and I kept my job, and I told myself I was doing the right thing by keeping my head down. The confessions continued, each woman offering up her own small piece of complicity, her own moment of cowardice or ignorance or willful blindness. It was not absolution they sought, they were all beyond that. It was simply acknowledgement. We were there. We were part of it. We will carry this forever. When the confessions finally exhausted themselves, Greta spoke. We can't undo it, she said. We can't go back and make different choices. But maybe we can make sure it never happens again. Maybe that's all we can do now. How? Anneliese asked, her young voice raw with confusion. How do we make sure? We remember, Greta replied. We tell the truth even when it's terrible, especially when it's terrible. We don't let anyone forget, including ourselves. We don't let anyone say it didn't happen, or it wasn't that bad, or we didn't know. We knew enough. We all knew enough. The summer stretched on, hot and long. Letters began arriving from Germany, censored, heavily edited, but letters nonetheless. The news they contained was grim. Cities still in ruins. Food still scarce. The occupation zones divided and tensions rising between the Soviets and the Western Allies. Germany, it seemed, would not be unified anytime soon. Germany, it seemed, might never be the same country again. Some women received news of deaths. Fathers, brothers, sons confirmed killed in the final battles or died in Soviet camps. Some learned their homes had been completely destroyed, their streets erased from maps. Some simply heard nothing at all, which was perhaps worst of all, the absence of information, the void where loved ones had been. Anneliese received a letter that made her collapse in the yard, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. Her entire family, mother, father, 3 younger siblings, had been killed in the final days of the war when their village was caught between retreating German forces and advancing Americans. Killed by German soldiers, the letter said, for trying to surrender, for hanging white sheets from their windows. She was an orphan at 18, a prisoner in a foreign country, with nothing to return to even if she could return. Greta and Ilse sat with her through the night, holding her while she cried, offering no platitudes or false comfort because there was none to offer. What do you say to someone whose entire world has been erased? What comfort exists for that particular kind of loss? In the morning, Anneliese was different, older somehow, harder. I want to stay in America, she announced at breakfast, her voice flat. I want to apply for emigration. There's nothing for me in Germany. There's nothing for me anywhere. But at least here I can start over. At least here I can be someone new. The bureaucracy of emigration was complex and slow, a maze of forms and interviews and background checks. The American government was opening pathways for displaced persons. But being a former prisoner of war complicated matters. There were quotas and waiting lists and endless questions about ideology and party membership and what exactly you had done during the war. Anneliese applied first, with Greta's help translating the forms and drafting the required letters. Then others followed. By autumn, more than half the women in the camp had submitted applications to remain in America. Some were motivated by practicality. There was simply nothing to return to. Others were motivated by hope, the possibility of starting over, of building a life untainted by the past. Greta herself waited longer, torn between guilt and longing. To leave Germany felt like abandonment, like running from responsibility. But to return to Germany felt like returning to a grave, like choosing to live among ghosts. It was Morrison, the camp commander, who finally convinced her. You feel guilty about leaving, he said one afternoon in the administrative office. But guilt isn't a plan. Guilt isn't a life. You can carry your history with you, you should carry it with you, but you don't have to let it be the only thing you carry. So Greta applied. She filled out the forms in her careful handwriting, answered the questions truthfully, submitted letters of recommendation from Morrison and from Corporal Hayes and from an American chaplain who had started visiting the camp weekly. She underwent interviews where stern-faced officials asked her about her beliefs, her actions during the war, her understanding of what had happened and why. Do you feel you bear responsibility for the crimes of the Nazi regime? One interviewer asked. Greta met his eyes. Yes, she said simply. Not legal responsibility, perhaps. I committed no war crimes. But moral responsibility? Yes, we all bear that. We were there. We participated in the system, even if we told ourselves we were just doing our jobs, just surviving. That doesn't excuse it. Nothing excuses it. The interviewer wrote something in his notes. And if you're allowed to stay in America, what will you do with that responsibility? I will remember, Greta said. I will teach. I will tell the truth about what happened, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it implicates my own nation, my own people. I will make sure that kind of forgetting, that kind of willful blindness, never happens again, at least not with my silence. The approval, when it came months later, felt anticlimactic. A letter in English and German, informing her that her application for immigration had been accepted, that she would be released from custody and granted a visa, that she would need to register with the authorities and report quarterly for the first 2 years, that she would be eligible for citizenship after 5 years of residency. She held the letter in her hands and felt nothing at first. Then, slowly, something like relief began to seep through the numbness. She wouldn't have to return to the ruins. She wouldn't have to walk through Dresden's ash or Berlin's rubble or stand in the remains of her mother's house and try to imagine a future there. She could stay in this strange, abundant, complicated country and try to build something new. Ilse received her approval the same week. So did Annalise. So did 37 other women from the camp. They were released in stages, processed through immigration offices, given identification papers and travel documents and small amounts of money to help them start over. The Lutheran church in the nearby town had organized a sponsorship program, families willing to host the German women temporarily while they found jobs and housing. Greta was matched with the Hoffmans, no relation to Ilse, an older couple whose own children had grown and moved away. Mr. Hoffman worked at the railroad. Mrs. Hoffman had been a nurse during the First World War and still volunteered at the local hospital. Their house was small but clean, a 2-story wood frame building with a front porch and a garden out back. They gave Greta a room on the 2nd floor, a small space with a bed and a dresser and a window that looked out over the street. It was more privacy than she had had in years. "We're not doing this to be saints," Mrs. Hoffman explained on that first evening, serving dinner at the kitchen table. Pork chops and green beans and mashed potatoes, portions that still seemed impossibly large to Greta. "We're doing this because it's the right thing to do. War's over. Time to help people get back on their feet." "I am grateful," Greta said carefully. "I will work hard. I will cause no trouble." Mr. Hoffman grunted, cutting his pork chop. "You speak German?" he asked suddenly. "Yes," Greta replied, surprised. "It is my language." "My grandfather spoke German," Mr. Hoffman said. "Came from Heidelberg in 1889. My father refused to speak it after the First War. Said it was unpatriotic. But I always thought it was a shame, losing that connection." He looked at Greta directly. "Maybe you could teach me. Help me recover something that was lost." It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. This man whose country had just defeated hers, whose soldiers had occupied her homeland, was asking her to teach him her language. It was reconciliation in miniature, forgiveness in practice. Greta found work as a translator for the county courthouse, helping process other displaced persons and refugees who were beginning to arrive in increasing numbers. The pay was modest but steady. The work was meaningful. She spent her days helping others navigate the same bureaucratic maze she had navigated, explaining forms and procedures and rights in German and Polish and sometimes Russian. Evenings, she taught Mr. Hoffman German grammar while Mrs. Hoffman knitted and listened. Weekends, she met with Ilse and Annalise at a small cafe in town, where they drank coffee, always coffee, good American coffee that had become their ritual, their sacrament, and talked about their new lives and their old lives and the strange liminal space between. Annalise had found work at a textile factory, operating machines that she learned quickly. She was saving money, she said, to eventually go to school. She wanted to study nursing. She wanted to help people, to create something good out of all the loss. Ilse had been hired by a local school district, not as a teacher yet. Her German credentials meant nothing here, but as a classroom aide. She worked with children who struggled with reading, helping them sound out words and gain confidence. "It's not the same as teaching," she admitted, stirring sugar into her coffee. "But it's something. And the children, they don't care where I'm from. They just care that I'm patient with them." They sat in the cafe window, 3 German women in American clothes, donated dresses and coats, shoes from charity drives, drinking coffee and watching the town move around them. It was October now, autumn turning the Pennsylvania trees brilliant shades of orange and gold. The air had that particular crispness that promised winter, but for now the sun was warm and the world felt, if not welcoming exactly, at least not actively hostile. "Do you miss it?" Annalise asked suddenly. "Germany, I mean, home." Ilse considered this. "I miss what it was before, or what I thought it was. But that place doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it never existed the way I remember it." "I miss the language," Greta said. "I miss speaking German all day, thinking in German. English is better now, but it still doesn't feel like mine. Every thought has to be translated, and something gets lost in the translation." "I miss my mother's cooking," Annalise said softly. "Sauerbraten and spätzle and the Christmas stollen she made every year. I miss the smell of it. I miss—" She stopped, unable to continue. They knew what she missed. They all missed it. The ordinary details of lives that no longer existed, the small rituals and familiarities that had made up the texture of home. You could leave a country, But you couldn't leave memory. You carried it with you everywhere. A constant weight. A ghost limb that ached in weather changes. Winter arrived again, their second winter in America, but this time they experienced it as free women rather than prisoners. Greta spent Christmas with the Hoffmans, helping Mrs. Hoffman bake cookies using recipes that were similar to but not quite the same as the Christmas cookies of her childhood. They sang carols in English, and Mr. Hoffman gave a halting rendition of O Tannenbaum in his newly learned German, which made everyone laugh. It was a small Christmas, a quiet one, but it felt like a beginning, like perhaps it was possible to build traditions in a new place, to create continuity even across rupture and loss. The new year, 1948, brought changes. More displaced persons were arriving in America, driven by the tightening Soviet control of Eastern Europe. The town was absorbing refugees from Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Baltic states. The Lutheran Church's sponsorship program expanded. Suddenly there were dozens of foreign accents in the local shops and factories, people learning English, people trying to build new lives from fragments of old ones. Greta found herself increasingly busy at the courthouse, translating for this wave of newcomers. She heard stories that made her own experience seem almost gentle by comparison. Families who had survived concentration camps, people who had spent years in displaced persons camps waiting for any country to accept them, children who had been separated from their parents and were trying desperately to find them. One afternoon, she was translating for a Polish woman named Zofia who had survived Auschwitz. The woman was applying for work papers, but the official processing her application was asking standard questions about employment history, questions that made no sense in the context of what Zofia had endured. "Tell him," Zofia said in Polish, her voice flat, "that my employment history from 1943 to 1945 was being a slave laborer in a death camp. Tell him I worked in the sorting rooms, going through the belongings of people who had just been murdered, and that I survived by stealing bread and hiding during selections. Ask him if he needs me to provide a reference letter from my supervisor." The bitterness in her voice was corrosive. Greta translated more gently, explaining the situation, and watched the official's face go pale as he realized what he'd been asking. "I'm sorry," he stammered. The forms don't. I'm sorry." After the appointment, Greta walked Zofia outside. They stood on the courthouse steps in the weak winter sunlight, two women from destroyed countries trying to find footing in this strange new world. "You're German," Zofia said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Greta replied. "I was Wehrmacht auxiliary. Communications. I was taken prisoner in France in 1945. Zofia studied her face. "Did you know about the camps?" "I knew something," Greta said honestly. "Not the full extent. But I knew enough to know it was wrong. And I said nothing. I did nothing." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Zofia said, "I hate your country. I hate your language. I hate everything about what was done to my people in your country's name." She paused, then added, "But you helped me just now. You spoke for me with kindness. So maybe hate is not useful anymore. Maybe hate is just another way of staying in the past." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. But it was something, an acknowledgement that they were both here now, both trying to survive in the aftermath, both carrying unbearable histories. "The coffee here is very good," Zofia said suddenly, unexpectedly. "In the camp, we dreamed about coffee. Real coffee. When I got to America and they gave me real coffee, I cried for an hour." Greta felt something loosen in her chest. "The first time I had American coffee," she said, "I said it was heaven. I hadn't tasted anything that good in years." Zofia almost smiled. "Heaven in a cup. Maybe that's all we can hope for now. Small heavens. Small moments of good." Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived it was glorious. The Pennsylvania countryside exploded with green, wildflowers appearing along the roadsides, trees budding and leafing out until the world seemed impossibly lush. Greta walked to work each morning through this abundance, still marveling at how much had survived the war intact, how much had simply continued growing and blooming as if nothing had happened. She had been in America for nearly 2 years now. Her English was fluent. She had American friends, women from the Lutheran Church, colleagues at the courthouse. She was saving money, planning to eventually get her teaching credentials validated, to maybe one day stand in front of a classroom again. But she also maintained ties to the other German women, the ones who had been in the camp with her. They met monthly at the cafe, a ritual they had established and refused to break. Some had moved away, finding work in other cities. Others had married, mostly other displaced persons, but a few had married American men. Anneliese was engaged to a young man from Latvia who worked at the same textile factory. They planned to marry in the summer. At one of their meetings, Frieda appeared. She had been approved for immigration later than most, had spent an extra 6 months in the camp because of concerns about her munitions work. But now she was out, staying with a Quaker family who had sponsored her, working as a cleaner at the local hospital. She looked older, frilier, but also somehow more at peace. "I've been talking to the Quakers about forgiveness," she told them over coffee. "They have this belief that there is goodness in everyone, that even the worst person can be redeemed. I don't know if I believe that, but I'm trying to believe it about myself." "Do you sleep?" Ilse asked gently. "Sometimes," Frieda admitted. "I still have nightmares. I still see their faces, the ones in the striped uniforms. I still hear the sounds of the factory. But the Quakers tell me that carrying guilt is different from carrying responsibility. Guilt paralyzes. Responsibility motivates. So I'm trying to transform one into the other." "How?" Anneliese asked. "I'm volunteering at a refugee assistance center," Frieda said, "helping new arrivals get settled. Translating just like Greta, helping them navigate the system. It doesn't make up for anything. It doesn't balance the scales. But it's something I can do now with the life I still have." They sat together, these women who had been enemies and prisoners and refugees and were now becoming slowly Americans. They drank their coffee, always good coffee, always that small, reliable pleasure, and talked about their futures and their pasts and the impossible work of building a life in the space between. "I've been thinking," Greta said, "about what we tell the next generation. If we have children, if we teach students, what do we say about where we come from and what happened?" "The truth," Ilse said immediately. "But not just the facts. The feeling of it. How easy it was to look away, to tell ourselves we were just surviving. How ordinary people became part of something monstrous. Not because they were monsters, but because they were afraid or tired or convinced themselves it wasn't their problem." "And the coffee?" Anneliese asked, lifting her cup. "Do we tell them about the coffee?" Greta smiled softly. "Especially the coffee, because it reminds us that small kindnesses matter, that humanity persists even in the darkest times, that sometimes heaven is just a cup of good coffee when you've forgotten such things exist." The afternoon light slanted through the cafe windows, illuminating dust motes and steam rising from their cups. Outside, American life continued its ordinary rhythm. People shopping, children playing, the world turning as if it had never stopped, as if there had never been a war at all. But these women knew differently. They carried their history in their bones, in their dreams, in every moment of silence when memory ambushed them. They would carry it forever, this knowledge of what humans could do to each other, what they themselves had been part of, willing or not. Yet they also carried this, the possibility of beginning again, the hard work of bearing witness, the daily choice to build something better from ruins. And yes, the simple pleasure of good coffee shared with friends who understood, who remembered, who refused to forget. "To remembering," Greta said, raising her cup. "To truth-telling," added Ilse. "To small heavens," finished Anneliese. They touched their cups together, a quiet ceremony of their own making, and drank deeply. The coffee was excellent, as always, rich and strong and real, a taste of grace in a world that needed all the grace it could find. Outside, a mockingbird sang from a telephone wire, its song carrying across the Pennsylvania afternoon. The same bird, perhaps, that had sung that first evening at the camp. Or its descendant. It didn't matter. The song was the same, clear and untroubled, a reminder that life persisted, that beauty remained, that even in the aftermath of unimaginable destruction, the world continued to offer its small, essential gifts. They finished their coffee and walked out into the spring sunshine. 3 women who had survived, carrying their past forward into an uncertain but possible future. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.